This is a serious intellectual, contemporary American writer who is reflective about his craft and about his calling, and who I can imagine must have been a completely transfixing and inspiring instructor / mentor for these students. And I'm not here to defend Ta-Nehisi Coates. I think there's an interesting intellectual challenge to all of us, not just him, in our time about the deeply disconcerting moral dilemmas, tragic moral dilemmas that are raised by this historical development. But he's persuaded that Israel is an apartheid state.
Most of Black New York think that he should step down, according to the latest polls. But nevertheless, there are ones. They tilt older, but there are Black people in New York who basically are inclined to think that he's being singled out because he's Black, as so many Black people have been singled out, especially in the past, for that reason. And that what's more important is his symbolic value as being for Black people, so to speak. But no, it doesn't look like that is going to be a significant force in determining whether or not he's going to stay in power.
Hello, John McWhorter. How are you doing?
Hey, Glenn, how are you?
Doing well, thanks. Glenn Loury here. The Glenn Show with John McWhorter. We talk every other week. He's my conversation partner. We've been doing it for a long time. I teach at Brown University, and I'm John Paulson Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. The Manhattan Institute sponsors the Glenn Show. And John teaches at Columbia University and writes regularly for the New York Times. Here we are, John, just a few weeks before maybe the most important election of our lifetime. What do you think? Did you see that debate, Vance and Walz?
In so many excerpts and having read so much about it that, yes, I was actually out that night and decided that I would just read about it rather than watch it. But Vance is clearly a very smart person. And Walz, it's like he's winding down. He's not great at that format. And so I thought, and now I'm really being a phony because I didn't actually watch it from beginning to end, but from everything that I've read and all the clips that I've seen, Vance did the best job he possibly could have until the end, where the motherfucker refused to admit that the election was not in any real sense stolen. And just in that glassy-eyed way, articulate as hell, sat there and just lied. And so, this continues the way we discussed him last time. It's like something out of some TV movie. It's so transparent. A TV movie, there's a dated reference.
He's Donald Trump's vice president. What did you expect him to say? I mean,
Well, that he shouldn't be running for vice president with Donald Trump anyway. That's what you wind up having to do. But it was so sad watching him doing it.
Yeah. Well, I agree that he presented himself very well, and that Walz seemed nervous and a little bit out of his depth. It is the vice presidency, which is like a warm cup of spit or something like that. It's not real. It's not a real job. It's not like anything significant hangs on it.
Somebody put it that way? Is that a quote?
Somebody put something that way.
Okay.
I don't know if they made reference to this particular job with that. It's in the back of my mind. I don't know where it comes from exactly. Lying about the 2020 election, yeah, I agree. He could have just said the election was decided, courts weighed in or declined to weigh in at their discretion, and whatever. But how could he say that and be Trump's vice president? It seems to me that's the real offense. The real offense is that he's a constituent part of this ticket and of this movement, which has a mythology about the 2020 election that is absolutely central to its self-understanding.
Mm-hmm. It's ridiculous. But, well, let's see. What's the race news of the week? I imagine one thing would be Mr. Coates, who is back, and he has his book, The Message. So,
have you read it?
Of course not. However, I have read a lot about it. And so, have you read it?
I have, actually.
You actually read it? Oh, okay.
Yeah. The book came out on October 1st, which was a few days ago, and I had pre-ordered it. So it arrived by Amazon, and I picked it up and I couldn't put it down, frankly. I think the book is brilliant, John.
Do inform me. I'm sincerely interested. Wow.
Well, okay, so the book is called The Message. It's a series of essays which are phrased as an open letter to his writing class students at Howard University from a couple of years ago, where he taught a course, a small seminar on writing. The first essay is a tribute to the art and craft of politically engaged journalism, what journalism is for, is inspiring his students and also kind of characterizing his own raison d'etre. What drives him? Why is he
Glenn, is
doing what
this the
he's
part
doing?
where he argues that complexity is a white thing and that if you're, say, a black journalist, then you should be going not for complexity, but for telling the truth? Is that where he makes that point?
I think it's consistent with his argument, although I don't remember that point specifically, especially phrased in racial terms. But he does invoke the imperative of, as a black writer, giving voice to the aspirations, frustrations, the kind of political imperatives of his people, the liberationist kind of stance. But it's mainly about writing. It's about not getting too abstract, about attention to detail, about the power of words, about craft. And it's damn good, in my humble opinion. I'm not a literary guy, but I'm reading somebody thinking about words and writing, and I do write. Second essay takes him to Dakar, Senegal, and it's his trip back to Africa, back home, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
And it's well crafted, and in places insightful, in places moving, in places predictable, but it is surprising in some ways to me that it's open to a kind of criticism of the romantic uh, uh, allegorical way in which many Black Americans view going, quote unquote, home. He knows it's complicated. He knows that it, in some sense, is not really home. He knows that they're Black and we're Black, the Africans, the Senegalese, but it's not in any way an identity of, congruence.
Does Coates mention that Africans sold one another into slavery in massive numbers? Does that come up?
I don't remember it being specifically referenced, but it wouldn't have been out of place for him to have taken note of that. I mean, as I say, it's subtle. It's not hagiographic. It's not preachy. It's not triumphalist. Why do we African Americans cultivate mythological, narratives about great kingdoms, about African glory, of whatever, and the need to do that is viewed in a critical way. It's not slavishly, reflexively embraced.
Isn't his idea that he's interested in you and me connecting ourselves to Egypt, way up above the Sahara, rather than the West African societies that the slaves who created us actually came from, which were very different places? Isn't the idea that we have a right to create our own mythology, and so we come from the pharaohs and the pyramids rather
that
than...
idea is there. I mean, because he knows we quote unquote the descendants of those people who were transported across the Atlantic as slaves in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries were not Egyptians, and he knows that, but he defends the idea that we would embrace the Egyptian, the grandeur of a narrative in which the greatness of the Egyptian civilization is taken as our own. He defends that. He says we're entitled to our uh, defense of our dignity in the face of the overwhelming derogation of white supremacy and domination of the enslavers.
Glenn, I think that is complete bullshit. And I'm going to ask you something. It's this essentialization of Africanness. The Africans didn't see themselves back then as Africans. They were different peoples, and like all peoples all over the world.
He knows that, John. He knows that.
Warred against each other. Okay. Are you okay with that idea that it's okay for us, especially, in view of the fact that we've got historiography, we know what really happened, that we're supposed to create that mythology?
If I were in the mood to try to construct a critique of this kind of narrative that I'm doing a poor job of sketchily characterizing here, I think the reader ought to engage this work for himself, herself. It wouldn't be hard to do. I mean, who are we? I mean, that's where my critique would start. We, those of us who descend from African slaves, are not merely or mainly African. We're America. We're a product of the cauldron, which has shaped this polyglot continental nation into which the tributaries from many rivers flow. Sure, Africa's a part of it, but we're Negroes. We're the American Negro. And by the way, it's in flux. Kamala Harris, with respect, she's Black. Barack Obama, he's Black.
These are
Half
interesting
my
identities,
students,
yes.
A lot of my students of color are of various colors and combinations of colors because of the complexity of their own heritage. And in 100 years, it's going to be very, very different from the way it is right now. So
50 years.
The identitarian move that has a we are Africans central theme, I think is deeply problematic. And so all that mythology that gets built on that we is problematic. And it's problematic because the we is highly questionable and very much in flux, and perhaps not something that we should be essentializing and holding on to. But here my point is about Coates, and you should read the book when you get a chance. He knows all of that. And you don't read this book and come away thinking that this is Ibram X. Kendi. This is not Ibram X. Kendi. This is a serious intellectual, contemporary American writer who is reflective about his craft and about his calling, and who I can imagine must have been a completely transfixing and inspiring instructor / mentor for these students. That's the second essay is Dakar. The
Glenn,
third essay,
I'm going to interrupt briefly and just say, from what you're saying, and given that a lot of years have passed, and just by way of review, folks, the reason that I have a major reservation about Coates is because back in the day, water under the bridge, he was extremely abusive towards me in his quote unquote blog. And we don't need to dredge up the stuff, but to an extent that many people would find interesting, given that he's now thought of as this courtly intellectual gentleman. So there's some issues. And so I refuse to ever read Between the World and Me. And I am now never going to read it just because I'm almost enjoying not having read it. However, from what you're saying on this one, especially if it's not too long, I need to read it because you're talking about a version of him that I genuinely was not aware of and that I am very open to encountering. So I'll read it this week. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, John. Let me comment on your comment. Don't take it so personally, man. I mean, that was a long time ago.
It was.
Are you that unforgiving? If I cross you, I'm not going to get on your shit list, and then I'm going to have to worry about 5 years from now. You talking about Glenn. Glenn diss me, man. That motherfucker.
You know what, Glenn? One of my flaws is I do hold grudges. So, for example, when I first came out, so to speak, in 2000, Tavis Smiley had me on his show. Just beat the hell out of me. He had me on with somebody who openly hated me, let her talk more, gave her the last word. It was just a mess. And I said, I will never appear on anything that this man does again. And his peeps would call me over the years, and I'd say, never, ever again. I finally gave in, I believe, 2020. And so I let it go 20 years, and I defend that. I just thought, if you treat me that way, you should know that you will never have my services again. I do hold on to things to an extent. I don't wake up thinking about Ta-Nehisi Coates' insults, but when he comes up, I think this is somebody who dislikes me and has shown it often. So, yeah.
It's not about you, John.
I know it isn't.
Not about us individually and whatnot.
I will read the message.
Well, where was I?
So you've done the second part.
There's a letter to his kids about writing, and which is smart. There's Dakar and his encounter with Africa, which is thoughtful and interesting, and as I say, not predictable, not exactly what you might think an Ibram Kendi type would say. And I thought in some ways self-aware and subtle. There is, his book is controversial in some conservative school districts where a teacher might want to assign it and the parents might object to it being too much of a critical race theory Bible, his book, Between the World and Me. And so there's a South Carolina district where the controversy arises. One of the teachers wants to assign his book. There's a big fight within that district about that. They correspond, he and the teacher. She invites him to come to a school board meeting. He goes to South Carolina. And the essay is a narrative about that trip, that encounter with, culturally conservative community, where he finds a lot more support than he might have otherwise expected for teaching his book. And he talks about that. And then the final essay, which is the longest of the four, is about his trip to Israel. He is some writers of expedition. They spend a lot of time in the West Bank and Jerusalem, and he doesn't go to Gaza. This was before October 7th, but I think it was in 2023. And it is a blistering critique of Zionism. It is off the chain, man. Peter Beinart, former editor at the New Republic, a Jewish American writer who's pretty liberal and very sympathetic to Palestinians, says that Coates has a lot to lose, has taken his career into his hands. This book, Coates has been interviewed. I saw him on CBS morning show facing some very tough questioning, and
I've watched some of those
responded
things online.
unflinchingly. Yeah. But he's persuaded that Israel is an apartheid state.
You've heard me talk about Ground News. It's the website and app that I use to stay fully informed and to understand the media landscape. They gather articles from over 50,000 news sources around the world and help you break free from the algorithms and echo chambers. Go to ground.news/Glenn Show to see how it works. My favorite Ground News feature is the blind spot feed. It shows you stories that are disproportionately reported by either the left or the right. It really highlights the disjointed nature of our political discourse today. Here's a story underreported by the left. Freed Russian arms dealer Bout back in weapons business. That's the guy we traded for the basketball player Brittany Griner. And here's a story underreported by the right, also featuring Russia. Trump secretly sent COVID tests to Putin during 2020 shortage, Bob Woodward claims in new book. On Ground News, every story comes with a breakdown of how many news sources covered it, their bias distribution across the left, center, and right, how reliable these sources have been in the past, and who owns them. You can't get this type of news analysis anywhere else. I also really like the 2024 US election page. which enables you to fully compare the candidates and issues on the ballot. With their curated election coverage and blind spots sections, you can be sure you're getting every side of every story in this crucial election year. My listeners who subscribe through my link will get 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan, the same plan I use. So go to ground.news/Glenn Show. Click the link in the video description or scan the QR code to get Ground News for just $5 per month. Again, that's ground.news/Glenn Show. I hope you'll join me in supporting an independent platform trying to bring facts, transparency, and trust back to the news.
Glenn, are you sure that, and I haven't read it, and so maybe I'm missing something, but boy, have I read a lot of reviews, including Coleman Hughes's in the Free Press, which was excellent.
I haven't
seen
Are you sure
that Coates actually gives a principled justification of what I'm assuming is his opinion that Israel shouldn't have happened? Or does he cherry pick a few episodes from here and there? Does he make a real case that a public intellectual is responsible at his level of making? Does he appear to have done his homework?
I think he's going to be susceptible to that kind of criticism. He didn't go deep enough. He didn't read enough books. He doesn't know enough about Douglas Murray and him in a debate. Douglas Murray is going to throw the book at him. You don't know what you're talking about, but not. I wouldn't criticize his essay from that point of view. In a way, he kind of knows that he doesn't know all the way down, that he doesn't,
but his feelings are more important because he's
it's
black?
Not his feeling. It's not his feeling. This is his position. His position is it's an apartheid state.
But does he address why?
And he's against apartheid. No, his position is that's wrong. If you watch these interviews, you've heard him use this device. He says, I'm against the death penalty. And I'm against it whether you're applying the death penalty to someone who stole a candy bar or you're applying it to someone who slaughtered 10 babies and then ate them. I'm against the death penalty. And therefore, when I see apartheid, and what I see there is apartheid, this is his position based on his experience. I see, and he describes in vivid detail aspects of what he's calling apartheid. I'm against that.
I'm not impressed by this.
And there's nothing the Palestinians could have done or are doing that's going to make me not be against that.
I'm not impressed by this at all. I find this a simplistic analysis of a very complex situation. Calling it apartheid, there's a certain music to it. Everybody jumps when you say it, just like he institutionalized the term white supremacy in the same way. But what would he suggest be done differently given the reason for this apartheid? It's very complex. And I imagine that his idea would be, what a lot of this all comes down to is he thinks Israel shouldn't have been established, but what is his justification for that? Why should there not have been what's called a partition? And there have been partitions all over the world. And I imagine that his reason would be because they're white and the Palestinians are brown. But does he come out and say that, or does he just assume that we think that? Because that's a sloppy
why
kind of
don't we
argumentation.
circle back to this? I think you ought to read the thing that we're talking about, and then we can talk about it. But I'm going to answer you directly. He is against the project of establishing a Jewish state. He does think that an ethnographic definition of statehood in a population that is heterogeneous is deeply problematic. And that's the moral starting point for his critique. But he employs, and I can hear Coleman critiquing this move that he makes, his experience as a descendant of slaves in the context of the United States, as a dominated people who have to deal with the subjugation, the stigma, the dehumanization, the relegation to the backwaters and the margins and the corners of society. And as a writer, as a moral agent in our time who has that history in his blood, quote unquote, to say that I can't countenance silently what I am observing being perpetrated here. To me, you don't have to have an answer to be able to defend that position.
I think you do. And I am
What should Israel do?
No.
Why is it my responsibility to have an answer to that question in order to be appalled at what Israel is doing?
No, not with his influence. And given how much is written about this, how richly it's been discussed, he's not responsible for coming up with a game plan, but he's supposed to explain why he thinks that there should be no Israel, especially because in the same book, he says that we should embrace a mythology that we come from Egypt.
He doesn't say there should be no Israel. He says there should be no apartheid.
But does he understand the history that's led to this apartheid? And then also, if I may...
as much as any well-read and intelligent person, and he is both of those things, could be expected to understand it.
And then, in the book, he never mentions what happened on October 7th. Theoretically, because, he wrote it after that happened, but, he uses the passive voice, people were killed, etc. But apparently he thinks that anything Hamas does, the implication is that anything Hamas does is justified because, as you're putting it, or he would put it, they are enduring an apartheid, which is not justified because whether or not Israel is trying to protect itself from being bombed out of existence through this apartheid, it's all moot because Israel shouldn't be there in the first place. Does he actually lay out that argument? Or are we just to assume that there should be no Israel and that therefore he doesn't have to mention October 7th when a book drops a year after that happened? Genuine question.
Yeah, I'm not going to answer that question. I'm not here to defend Ta-Nehisi Coates. I think there's an interesting intellectual challenge to all of us, not just him, in our time about the deeply disconcerting moral dilemmas, tragic moral dilemmas that are raised by this historical development. And he's giving one man's, he is not a random person taken off the street. He is an influential figure. I agree.
Mm-hmm.
Account rooted in his identity, but also in his responsibilities as a writer and as a citizen in reaction to that. And I think it's worth kind of pausing for a minute about that because, a lot of Jewish Americans and a lot of Israelis basically agree with him about the moral challenge which this tragic historical evolution confronts us with. So I can only tell you this. I can tell you as a person who doesn't come in predisposed to like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who spent a lot of time reacting. I did read Between the World and Me. It's well crafted, but it rubbed me the wrong way in many respects, and I've said so. We've had our time here criticizing Ta-Nehisi Coates. I do teach his essay, The Case for Reparations, which is his signature long-form magazine journalism piece that kind of really solidified his reputation. And I have a lot of problems with a lot of what he has written and what he has done. But I picked this book up and put it down in the same day. And I thought, picked it up at the beginning and put it down at the end in the same day. It's a short book. And I thought, this is a fucking brilliant writer. The craft, it wasn't saccharine. It was silky, subtle, engrossing, captivating, really. Turns of phrase that I wanted to underline because I didn't want to not remember how enchanting some of the prose of the book is. And I thought, again, to have been a student of writing directed by this guy, or to receive this book having been his student, and to see this love of words enshrined in this way, and married to a kind of you can argue about the moral motivations of it. And I, in another voice, I would be arguing about it. As I've said, this we that he easily invokes about Africanness is, I think, deeply problematic. But I thought this is a serious person. So,
Glenn, I
want to say something else. I felt a little bit like chastising myself for being so dismissive of this guy because I didn't like his politics. I didn't like his racial politics in 2015-16. I didn't like his racial politics in 2020. I was on the other side. I'm the conservative, notes of a Black conservative over here. But I thought I wasn't really open-minded and fair in assessing the quality of the mind and the artistry of this guy. And I got to the end of that book, and when I put it down, notwithstanding his full-throated criticism of Zionism, I said, that's a brave dude there. That's a dude who's speaking his mind and speaking the truth that he thinks he's been given to know, and he's taking his career in his hands when he does so, and more power to him. I don't have to agree with him.
Glenn, I am utterly mystified, and with the risk acknowledged in that I have not read the book yet, I am utterly mystified, and I don't mean that rhetorically. I'm sitting here thinking that maybe I need to put my glasses on. I can't believe this is you saying this, and I'm trying to wrap my head around.
Why not, John?
Because, yes, he has a way with words, and I'm not minimizing that. Yes, he's a very good writer, and I see that you're admiring that. But my issue with him, frankly, has often been whether or not, I hate to say this, but put it this way. I have never seen in him the frame of mind that tries to work out a problem, that looks at something that's complicated and tries to think out of the box, to figure out a solution or to figure out an explanation to go from A to B. It's always seemed to me that for him, the constant leitmotif, the constant theme is Black, good, white supremacy, bad, I'm Black. That's everything. And so now he's applied that to Israel. But if you're going to look at something and call it apartheid and write artistically about that, that's one thing. But why the apartheid? When we call it a complex situation, I'm afraid that complex here means that to simply diss Zionism right out, you have a case to make. And especially if you're him, I'll put it that way. He's not somebody who seems to me to make a case. And that's been true for his whole career. There's just a certain kind of feeling. And you and I used to agree about that. And I know that maybe I'm missing something. For example, I'm not terribly literary. I probably read 6 fiction books a year. Usually 3 of them are ones that I've been told I have to read. I like to try to solve a problem. That's what linguistics is, although a lot of people have no reason to know that. You're trying to come up with a solution to something. And that's what economics is. Well, and so maybe I'm just the wrong person. I'm going to read that book. But I'm really surprised that you are so willing to let pass the ratiocination that one would expect, given the richness of this topic. You're saying he's no Kendi. And I've always thought that he brings more to the table than Kendi, certainly. But to do this whole thing, it's apartheid, and to say nothing about the 1,200 people who Hamas killed and the 200 more who were taken into captivity and, who many are dying now, that doesn't get one mention. I don't, that strikes me as almost willfully uncomplex. But you're saying that there's something about this book that transcends all of that, and I'm open. I will read it this week. I'm going to write it down, make sure I do it.
Okay, why don't we circle back to this topic? I'm not going to try to respond to your disappointment in me for not being as...
I'm sorry, Glenn. I'm perplexed.
Critical, Kenny.
Perplexed.
We will revisit the subject and leave it at that for now.
John and I often talk about higher education on this podcast. Attacks on free speech, lack of viewpoint diversity on campus, the erosion of academic standards, and now campus unrest and protest. Higher education is in crisis. With all that's going on, to whom can one turn as a trusted resource of all issues related to higher ed reform? The American Council of Trustees and Alumni is one source we want to strongly recommend as a credible and respected voice on all these issues. We're pleased to have ACTA supporting this episode. And ACTA has some exciting news. Its annual Athena conference and gala dinner is coming up Friday, October 18th. John and I attended in 2022 when John was the recipient of ACTA's Philip Merrill Award for Outstanding Contributions to Liberal Arts Education, and I was invited to give a tribute speech on that occasion. In addition to that award, ACTA will also present its Hero on Intellectual Freedom Award, and the 2024 recipient will be Harvard economist Roland Fryer, whom longtime listeners will recognize as a friend and colleague. His tribute speaker will be the co-founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, Ian Rowe, also a previous guest on our program. Visit ACTA's website, www.goacta.org, to register to attend ACTA's Athena Conference and Gala at the Ronald Reagan Building in Washington, D.C. on October 18th, 2024.
So what about Eric Adams?
What about him? Looks like he's on up Schitt's Creek without a paddle, as they used to say.
He thinks that he's being persecuted because he's a black man.
He's playing the race card. Yeah, that's pretty transparently ridiculous, isn't it?
You know, you and I had a discussion. It was the one where we were in a beautiful apartment and I was in a purple shirt. Remember the time we were in that?
Yeah, we were in New York City.
Yeah.
We had rented a little room and a crew. Oh, it was Rob Montz. Rob Montz, yes, the filmmaker, the documentary filmmaker, had come up to New York and recorded us live. And we were talking about Adams, were we?
Yeah, we were talking about Adams, and I was trying to, I was criticizing myself because I had always just found him distasteful. And I realized that the reason was just his manner. I didn't like the cut of his jib, that kind of, that deliberate swagger. It's not to my personal taste. And I realized I was being a snob because some of the policies that he was espousing, such as his attitude towards law enforcement and some things he said about schooling, seemed to me to make sense. I thought that I needed to realize that I needed to get over not liking his manner because he was going to create a New York that I thought would be better in many ways than what Bill de Blasio created, except for Bill de Blasio leaving us with pre-K for everybody, which was actually a really great move. But otherwise, de Blasio did some really fucked up stuff. And so I opened myself up to Adams, met him briefly once. He's very charming. But now it seems like, that thing that I didn't like about him, the way he's been not running the city and what he seems to cherish really are symptomatic of the sort of thing I saw in him before. And it disappoints me. The swagger is everything. The actions are less important than what things look like and atmosphere and him being out on the town. He hangs out with unsavory friends and he thinks that's okay. It's been really disappointing. And then, of course, when he gets nailed on it, it's because he's black. And
does that have any traction? Excuse me for interrupting, but I'm just curious who in the vast expanse of the New York City electorate is moved by that card being played. Because it looks transparently self-exculpatory and opportunistic, the race card being played by Eric Adams when he's caught, in effect, taking bribes from the Turkish government and whatever other bill of indictment has been levied at him. Who's the audience for that move?
Black New York and also white fellow travelers of Black New York, although it's only working so well. Most of Black New York think that he should step down, according to the latest polls. But nevertheless, there are ones. they tilt older, but there are Black people in New York who basically are inclined to think that he's being singled out because he's Black, as so many Black people have been singled out, especially in the past, for that reason. And that what's more important is his symbolic value as being for Black people, so to speak. But no, it doesn't look like that is going to be a significant force in determining whether or not he's going to stay in power. I suspect he's going to get by with a lot of this, but it's been very disappointing. I tried to look past that way that he has about him, and it turned out that the things he's doing are consonant with that way that he had about him. I don't know. It's been very
When's the next election? Is it 2025?
Mm-hmm.
He's toast, isn't he?
He will not be voted back in. Yeah, I think it's unlikely. But,
he's the first New York mayor to face federal corruption charges. Is that correct?
Even
Rudy Giuliani managed to escape without drawing the attention of the feds to that effect.
It makes me think about New York City mayors. There's a book in that I'm not going to write because it's fun even in the late 1800s. It's just one story after another. But yeah, Adams is he's an extreme case in how open and transparent it all was. Yeah. There's a sloppiness that you see in his not covering his tracks, which you see in it's a New York problem in general. It's a New York State problem. But long ago, I wrote about it with even Charles Rangel, and I have no issue with Charles Rangel, but he got stuck in some awkwardness, Congressman Charles Rangel. And a lot of it just had to do with sloppy bookkeeping that he seemed to think nobody was going to notice. It's just, sometimes I get the feeling that among brown legislators in this city and in this state, there's a sense that Blackness compensates for what a white legislator would have to think more about in terms of the sorts of things that you're trying to get away with. And I'm not sure why that is, but I wish that lesson were learned. And I'm not saying that there aren't, corrupt white legislators, but it seems that they put a lid on it more. And this is not just a Black thing. I'm thinking about, Robert Menendez is just so transparent, but here we are.
If you were asked to list what Eric Adams has accomplished in his 3 years as mayor of New York City, what would be on that list?
Glenn, I'd have to say nothing, and that's the problem. I mean, I was discussing him with some people who are better connected to power than I am, and we were agreeing that he doesn't seem to be a serious person in that way that we're beginning to use that expression. He doesn't seem to be a serious man about larger things. It seems to be all about him as a figure. It's as if he's a performer. No, I can't think of anything significant. And I
gather there's been a fair amount of turnover in top administrative jobs in his administration.
Mm-hmm. More than usual. Yeah.
I saw Andrew Yang, who ran against him for the mayoralty, at somewhere Substack somewhere, saying, "I told you so," in so many words. That is, during the campaign, when I was debating with Eric Adams, I asked him a set of questions about some shady aspects of his own background that nobody in the press took sufficiently seriously, but chickens have now come home to roost or, shown their true colors or whatever. And I could have told you that it was going to end up like this. This is Andrew Yang.
So
Amy Wax, John, I saw you defending her in your column, so to speak, kind of a backhanded defense. You want to talk about that? Amy Wax is the law professor at the University of Pennsylvania, very controversial figure, a guest frequently on the Glenn Show, where she has held forth to her outrageous effect in taking anti-woke position. She thinks what she thinks about the issues that, and we don't have to rehearse what those issues are. If you want to, you can. But she was brought up on charges first by her dean and then higher administration at the University of Pennsylvania for, in effect, dereliction of duty and behavior unbecoming of a faculty member, and has now been duly sanctioned and has exhausted her appeals within the university framework. I mean, she may have a lawyer and be thinking about bringing some kind of a legal action if the courts will countenance it. but I saw you defending her.
Yeah, one must be principled about these things. And I really talk about Coates and just feeling it in his gut. In my gut, I realized that hearing about her being sanctioned, there was one part of me thinking, good, she deserves it. And then another part of me thinking, but no, she doesn't deserve it. And somebody black needs to say so. It's one of those things. I mean, just, to cut to the chase. In addition to extremely sexist things in terms of what she said about women, some things she said about Asians, in terms of us being the black guys, she has said things like, she has said that she has almost never seen one of her black law students in the top quarter of the class, and usually not even in the top half. I believe she said that to you. She has said the idea of a black man and a white woman living, in a white picket fence context is misleading, because the essence of blackness is, this kind of ghetto situation where, mothers having children by multiple men, et cetera. She said that, so in other words, for example, my life has been an aberration. Real blackness is, the sorts of things from, gangster rap.
We're not quoting her, we're paraphrasing just for the record.
And then also she brought avowed white supremacist Jared Taylor to a class to be a guest speaker, and then had the students come out to lunch with him. And this is somebody who openly thinks that black people are inferior mentally and culturally, and this goes back to the bestiality of Africanness. And all this is very open. And she brought him in, theoretically, I suppose, as representing one view, but why him? What was the point of that? So that's what she's done. And also, this should not be technically relevant to these things in a legalistic sense, but I think we both know that she expresses these things with an almost recreational glee. She seems to almost enjoy throwing the bombs and shaking her head at all these silly people who won't let her have her say. That's irrelevant, but that was in my gut. But the simple fact is, especially given that we have seen what a Jewish student is expected to put up with on a campus. Of course, there have been criticisms of anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic statements on campuses, but nobody is saying that a Jewish student should not have to hear somebody yelling from the river to the sea into a megaphone as they go to class. Nobody is saying that that cannot be permitted. There's a such thing as free speech, and free speech can sometimes be extremely unpleasant. That's what we think. Well, if that's true, then having somebody laughingly bringing Jared Taylor to campus and talking about black people as dumb and bestial, et cetera, that has to be something tolerable. Now, if she were running in yelling into people's faces, that'd be different. But what she's doing, I think in 50 years, it'll look peculiar that it was thought that she needs to be sanctioned to that extent, given that it's about black people, which I think is the main thing that motivates all of this.
Well, what has this got to do with what Jewish students have got to tolerate? I'm not following you. I mean, are you saying if they'll make the Jewish students listen to someone who is an anti-Zionist, then they need to make the black students listen to someone who's a racial realist, which is what she calls herself?
Crude way of putting it, but yes, frankly, yeah. And or even if the campus protests hadn't happened, I would say that it's coddling us to make it so that if somebody does that 1/3 rail and talks about race, then that person has to basically be, what they really want is to fire her. They can't do that. And so they do the next best thing, because we must make it clear that we are anti-racist. It's all a little Ibram Kendi, if you ask me. I think it's condescending. Yes, I think that Amy Wax's views are, they're perplexing often. It's kind of like with Trump. They barely make sense. I'm not always sure where she's coming from, and I can tell she enjoys doing it. It's unfortunate. And it's unfortunate that a black student at Penn has to be on the campus knowing that there's a person like that. But frankly, that doesn't justify muzzling her unless there's anything else that she would be muzzled for. I don't get it.
Well, they're punishing her. She's been suspended with half pay for a year or two, if I'm not mistaken. She's had her summer stipend, a salary increment that is common in academia for people to support them over the summer months, suspended or revoked, and other limitations. I don't have the list in front of me at the moment, but it wouldn't be hard to enumerate the penalties that have been imposed upon her for having opinions. to my mind, that's an absolute abomination. She gets to have the opinions that she has. I mean, that's what academic freedom is meant to protect, isn't it? I mean, so I was appalled by the way that events developed at the University of Pennsylvania and terrified by it. What about my opinions? I agree with some of the things that Amy Wax has said. I think I don't know the facts about the academic performance of students in her class, and she's been admonished not to talk about that because it reveals, grade information by race, which is a violation of privacy, so they allege. Although if I were to say my Asian students are on the whole outstanding in my mathematical economics class, I don't know. I would be violating the same code, wouldn't I? Or I'd just be stating a fact. I mean, is it racist for me to observe that? I'm not supposed to observe it, or I merely meant not to speak of it. And the thing that really struck me about that particular incident, about her reporting about how Black students are doing in her classes, no one ever presented any data to contradict her. And moreover, the thing that she was describing could be thought of as a natural consequence of the admissions policies, which were preferentially using lower academic thresholds on the law school admissions test and the college GPAs of applicants to the law school in order to compose a racially diverse class in the first place. So the Black students are coming in with lower test scores. You might expect that on average, they would be exhibiting lower academic performance in the classes for which those test scores were predictive of class performance. So, But Amy Wax has a lot of opinions. I don't share many of them, and anyone who goes into the archive of The Glenn Show and looks up my conversations with Amy Wax will see me pushing back on her, saying that there are too many Asian immigrants coming in or whatever. Too few Blacks in prison, because if they were in prison at the rate that they disproportionately commit the crimes, there would be more Blacks, not fewer of them in prison, et cetera. I push back against that. But that's neither here nor there as far as I'm concerned. She gets to have her opinions. My job is to refute and rebut where I don't agree. Students' jobs are to toughen up and know how to respond, because she's not the only person with opinions that they're going to find noxious, know how to fashion their own arguments, assess evidence, et cetera, on behalf of views that they are meant to be able to defend. So anyway, that's...
Yeah, and there's an elephant in the room here, and I'm going to...
What is it?
Let's address the elephant. This issue of, where Black students are in a law school class. And as you and I both know, Amy is not the first person to observe that. There was Sandra Sellers at Georgetown who didn't know that she was being recorded on Zoom, mentioning it to another professor, and she lost her job as a result. This is the thing, though. This is the thing. It's one thing to point that out. And yes, of course, logically, you might expect it, given the way racial preference policies work. But there's a constructive way of addressing it. And so, for example, Richard Sander, way back in the aughts, wrote about the same thing.
This is the UCLA law professor. UCLA law professor.
Where you give the affiliation. I can't remember what he was or is.
He is the UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, professor of law who had a big study published in the Stanford Law Review.
Right.
About the impact of affirmative action in legal education, arguing that on the whole, there was a mismatch of students, so that the use of affirmative action ended up with Black students being at more academically competitive venues in the elite law schools than they otherwise would be, and adversely affecting their performance, because where you are relative to other students matters a lot, and that you'd have more Black lawyers and a higher bar passage rate if you didn't have affirmative action, because they'd be better matched to schools more suitable to their individual level of achievement.
Yeah.
This is Richard Sander.
And the thing is, that was constructive and it was genuinely compassionate. He was trying to get across that the current situation is harmful to Black students, and there would be a way that we would make things better for Black students if we didn't have this mismatch. And he meant it. And part of the reason I know that he meant it is because I met him back then, and we talked about it extensively. He was making a compassionate, constructive point. And frankly,
And he was pilloried for it.
He was pilloried for it. However, there was that issue of the Stanford Law Review where they got 5 people to push back against him. And with all of their withering contempt and with all of their sincerity and with all of their compassion, the truth is, if you read all 5 of those studies, none of them made a dent.
They never refuted him.
Never made a dent in Sanders' basic point. There's a contrast between that and the way Amy Wax puts these sorts of things, where it doesn't seem like she's making any kind of forget the compassion. There's nothing constructive. It seems like all she's saying is those Black students shouldn't be there, and then by extension, Black people are of inferior mind. And she's just content to leave it there. That's the problem. However, even there, I say, that doesn't mean that she loses her job or anything close to it, because free speech can be extremely unpleasant. And so, so I wrote that, and I'm catching it from both sides. But I think I'm making a valid point, and that's why I wrote that, and I wanted to make sure that I said something about it. Some people seem to think that because Amy Wax's points are sometimes not true, that she should lose her job. And I want to say, in response to those people who have written me, that no, free speech might not be true. The point is you debate and you point out the things that are not true, and that's what a debate partly consists of. It's just, when I read about what happened to her, part of my brain, my right brain thought, good, she deserves it. But then I thought my left brain wouldn't leave it alone. And I thought, no, she does not deserve that. So that was my point there.
All right. Ta-Nehisi Coates, Eric Adams, Amy Wax.
What a week. Yeah.
Yeah. J.D. Vance and Tim Walz.
Mm-hmm.
These are the figures of our time, and my back is killing me.
I'm sorry, Glenn. When your back hurts, that's your whole life. I know.
Yeah. But it'll get better.
I hope.
So, all right. I think we've concluded a conversation here, John.
I think we have.
See you in a couple of weeks.
In a couple of weeks.
Take care of yourself.